This is my spotted turtle. Her name is Koa. And in this video I'll build her a giant enclosure that resembles her native habitat in North America. But that's not where I want to start this video. Roughly 3 years ago I built our first tank, which I constructed from OSB boards and sealed with liquid rubber. Once dry I included a land area, but this wasn't a smooth process. Eventually I did manage to repair the leak and proceeded to scape the tank with cork rounds and river rocks. I also added this mesh to wick water and create a growing surface for moss. Some substrate and plants later and the tank was done. At the time it looked great, but 3 years later you can see it didn't work out the way I had hoped. The mesh I got apparently doesn't wick water, so the mossy background I envisioned never took off. The leak in the land area also returned, and to top it all off I realized I placed the heat bulb in a pretty bad spot, over this branch. This puts the heat lamp partially over the water, causing a lot of evaporation and making the basking spot somewhat hard to reach. All of this together made me decide to start over from scratch. I really liked the wooden tank and wanted to do something similar for a new setup. The new tank will be just as deep as the old one, but twice as long and a good bit taller. Construction was pretty easy, it just took some time. I won't go into much detail in this video as I showed it off before, but if you want to learn more I'll link up a video going into more detail at the end of this one. Once I constructed a sort of box out of sheets of OSB, I then added a layer of plywood around the structure, making sure to overlap all of the seams. Next it's time to waterproof the tank, and for that I'm going to use epoxy. I thought I had enough black pigment left, but it turned out to be just enough to stain the seam tape. No worries, I'll just spray paint the parts that will remain visible once this thing is done, before applying the final coat of epoxy. For the front of the tank I decided to go with sliding doors, so only a short piece of glass had to be siliconed in place. Unfortunately my camera stopped recording right before adding the glass. 2 days later the silicone cured and I could drill for bulkheads. Here you can also see the plane of glass. But all of this work would be for nothing if it couldn't hold water. I anxiously filled up the tank and a couple of days later not a single drop had leaked out, which means the tank could be stained and moved to the animal room. The tank is in, I love it, it's very big, but it's beautiful, it's gonna work out just fine. So now it's time to get started scaping this thing. These turtles can be found from southern Canada down through the eastern United States as far south as Florida. They typically inhabit shallow, slow-moving freshwater marshes, swamps, bogs and woodland ponds. So that's the look I set out to recreate. I started by siliconing a few pieces of glass to form the base of 2 small islands. Then I addressed the first part of the filt's return. This was a last minute idea that didn't end up working as planned, so I'll only touch on it briefly since I undo most of it later in the video. Basically I cut a piece of PVC pipe in half to create a water reservoir and added it to the background. I then poked a hole in the return tube to let the PVC fill with water. Once the silicone cured on both the pipe and the glass, I checked that the islands were waterproof and moved on to building the rest of the filt's return. Filtration is a bit tricky with spotted turtles. They prefer slow moving water, but to keep the tank clean I like using a fairly strong filter. In an attempt to get best of both worlds I split the return hose into 4 outlets. This spreads the flow and helps create a gentle circulation while still maintaining a high turnover rate. Now to create the background I'm going to try out a new technique. To start I attached a board to this awesome piece of wood to keep it in place while I slowly build up a base with pieces of XPS foam. The goal here is to lock in the general shape and hide the plumbing. As I worked through the tank, I added in some rocks and driftwood. Once I got all the XPS foam siliconed in place, I filled some voids with expanding foam. The next day the expanding foam had cured and I carved some of it down. I then taped over the frame of the tank, bulkheads and other areas that must remain unaltered. With this sloppy looking foam structure in place, we've just created the base layer for a really cool technique I'm excited to try. About 10 months ago I watched a video from Serpa Design in which he introduced a product that can be used to make some really cool backgrounds.
This incredible product, the Buddy Roads Vertical Concrete Mix. This is literally what is being used to create large zoo displays both in and around enclosures. It's non-toxic, eco-friendly, lightweight, strong, carvable, and fairly inexpensive.
Seeing the results in his African bullfrog tank and later in his cane toad tank blew me away, and I knew I had to try this stuff out for myself. So I did a little bit of research, made a couple of test pieces, and now here we are. I first measured out ramp and water, and since my goal is to create a muddy embankment, I also added a brown pigment. After mixing these together into the forbidden chocolate milk, I added the first half of the bag. That's when I realized I probably should have done this outside. So I quickly opened the window and turned on the fan, and then continued mixing the concrete. To get the concrete to stick to the foam, a mixture of 50-50 ramp and water first had to be sprayed on. Once tacky, I could start adding the concrete. At first I was a bit nervous if it would even stick, but quickly realized this might be one of the most fun ways to create a background. Just slapping the clay-like concrete in place, letting it stiffen up for a bit, and then carving out the desired texture was a lot of fun. And I say carving as if it's some sort of fine art technique, but in reality it was much closer to just scraping and poking the concrete until I liked what I saw. That said, the next day the concrete was off and I had to get some advice.
Yo, Crunchy, I'm in the shop right now working on some stuff, so I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about what's going on.
I'm working on a new tank and I'm using the vertical concrete mix. I'm aiming for sort of a muddy textured wall, if you will. And I'm really liking the texture so far, but I noticed that once it dries, the color starts shifting to a more grayish brown color and it all becomes really flat. You got any advice for me?
Yeah, I'm glad you're liking the technique, but it's pretty much mandatory that you gotta color it with some glazes. It's funny you mentioned something because I'm actually working on several projects right now that use the same technique, and I just ordered a ton of glazes, so if you need some, I can send it to you.
Oh wow, that'd be awesome. Thanks.
Oh, no problem at all. I'll ship it out later this week. I gotta get back to building that thing though, so I'll talk to you later.
Same here, man. I gotta get back to this tank. With the glazes on their way, I mixed up the second half of the concrete and got to work. One of the things I absolutely love about this technique is that you end up with barely any waste. Anything you carve off can be reused as long as it's still wet. Reusing carved off sections made it possible to create the entire background using only a single bag. Alright, we got the package. Wait, let me... Oh, that's better. That's better. We got the glazes and we got some spray bottle attachments. Okay, we got olive, black, umber and maple. This will work just fine. Let's get to work. In order to create more depth, I decided to start with a heavily diluted black and brush it onto the background, hoping it would sink into all the cracks, while removing the excess with a sponge would clean up the highlights. In some areas I did this with black, in others I did this with umber. And in completely other parts I first sprayed the concrete with water and then sprayed the glazes over it. I then went back and applied a second layer of glazes all over the background, but this time without diluting them. The idea here is to create variation in color to hopefully end up with a more realistic result. And once all the glazes dried, I think I achieved just that. A realistic faux mud wall. At this point I was really happy with how the tank was looking, until I realized I made a major design flaw. The last minute overflow ledge I created with PVC pipe was leaking into the land area. Water was creeping behind and through the gaps in the foam, eventually flowing out where it found the path of least resistance, which turns out to be this land area. I'll admit I didn't think this part through and I was mostly just hoping for the best. So what I should have done if I wanted this feature was make a little glass box, attach it to the background right around here, make the front piece of glass a little bit shorter than the side pieces, so it will only spill over the front, and then we'd have the feature. Now ideally I would have done the hose a little bit different. Instead of the weird contraption we have right now, I would have run it horizontal, add a little T connection up here, run it a little further, a corner connection, run it down, and then the bottom part can be exactly the same. And then from the T position I would add a little ball valve so I could control how much water is going in here, and then we have full control without any leaks. But as you've seen earlier in the video, I didn't do any of that. To address the issue, I filled the cracks with expanding foam from both sides and ran a bead of silicone along the exposed foam edges in both land areas. That should stop water from leaking into the land, but just to be extra safe, I also sealed off the original hole with more silicone. To still include the mossy ledge with ferns, I drilled several holes through the concrete and packed them with a mix of sphagnum moss and java moss. The idea is that moss will wick moisture up from the water feature, providing the ledge with moisture. But I couldn't test it out until I added the filter later. I addressed the terrestrial area of the setup first. Although the setup is meant to mimic a swamp or bog style environment, I don't intend for the substrate to be saturated with water all of the time. A false bottom will ensure excess water has a place to go, and a filter sponge wrapped in geotextile fabric seemed like the way to go. Although I've never seen Koa dig, I wanted to make sure the false bottom is tamper proof if she ever decides to dig. I also added a standpipe earlier to make the false bottom drainable if it's ever needed. Before adding the substrate to the main land area, I planted a pitcher plant, one of my personal favorites. It's also native to the same region as the spotted turtle, and unlike some of the plants I'll add later, it actually prefers soggy conditions. To meet its needs, I created a separate pocket along the water's edge that stays wet and allows water to flow in, while keeping it isolated from the main land area. At this point I was getting really excited about the build, and if you're enjoying this too, please consider subscribing. I got plenty more builds like this coming and you won't want to miss them. When mixing up the substrate, I started out by combining an old seasoned substrate with an old worm bin full of worm castings, springtails and some worms. These guys will form the base of the cleanup crew, but I'll later also add more springtails and some isopods. Next I also added sand, aqua soil, charcoal, rehydrated sphagnum moss and cocoa fiber, and finally also some small bits of bark. I mixed it all together and added it to the tank. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the goal here is to create something that resembles her native range in North America. Now I realized that the forests down in Florida look completely different from the ones up in Canada, so to make it a little easier I decided to focus on an area roughly in the middle. I did watch a ton of videos of people tracking these turtles down in the wild, so I think I got a pretty good idea of what their natural habitat looks like. That said, I'm only aiming for the overall look and feel, so I'm not too concerned whether or not all the plants I use are native to that area. Ferns, mosses and grass form the bulk of the plants, but I also include the cranberry bush, which is also a native to the turtle's habitat. On a side note, I've never seen Koa eat plants, but spotted turtles are omnivores, so I made sure that all the plants are safe and in some cases even beneficial if she ever decides to nibble on them. I've been working on this tank for so long now that I suddenly started second guessing my plant selection and needed to see it with leaf litter, sticks and pine needles throughout to make sure I was on the right track. I also experimented with more wood, but ultimately realized I just had to trust the process. Some more plants, installed the filter and filled the tank up with water. At this point I could finally test whether or not this ledge would continue to leak. I added some paper towel next to where the hole used to be and left the filter running. An hour later and the paper towel was still dry, while the sphagnum moss at the bottom of the ledge started wicking water up. This was perfect, so I filled up the rest with more moss and a little bit of aqua soil to help out the fern. Java moss was added as a final touch to both the ledge itself as well as the area directly below. My hope is that it will spread out and create a blanket just like this. I wanted to continue planting, but I had to address the light first. Up until now, this tank was lit using only 2 LED floodlights, but Koa needs a little bit more than just LED lighting. I measured where the heat bulb should go, but I removed it immediately after for reasons I'll explain later in the video. The UVB light could stay in place after installation. This lit up the tank even better and I was in awe of what I saw, but I had to stay focused. The tank needed draining so I could address the aquatic portion of the build. I'm going to keep it fairly simple here with only a few pond plants. These were planted with the original soil they came with and received a root stick for added nutrients. One of the plants I really wanted to add to this setup, but wasn't sure if it would even be viable, is a water lily. Most varieties will grow way too large for a setup like this, but I believe I found one that just might work, and if it doesn't, I can always remove it later. To cap the soil and cover the rest of the tank, I added a light brown sand. I did intend for this to be much darker, but I couldn't find anything with a fine enough grain, so this will have to do. I honestly don't really mind, especially since it will be covered with a layer of leaf litter anyway. With that, the tank could be filled up again, but not all the way yet. I still have to install the glass tracks and need some space for masking tape to hold the glass tracks in place. The next day I added a combination of bladder and ram's horn snails to the tank. These will help keep the tank clean as well as be a little snack for Koa to hunt down in between feedings. I know most people hate it, but I actually really like duckweed and it helps further naturalize the tank, so why not add it here. As a final detail, I decided to add even more moss and a few cuttings of oak leaf creeping fig. These look great and help tie it all together even more, but a final detail that can be overlooked is tinting the water. These turtles are pretty much always found in dark colored water, so I felt it was essential to capture the look of their natural habitat. And with that, the tank is done. Now I say that the tank is done, and for the sake of the video I also added Koa to her new tank, but in reality she'll remain in her old tank for a couple more weeks. I'll probably have more success with this setup if I allow the plants to settle and establish before adding her in. That's why I also didn't add the heat lamp just yet, as I only have a single dome and I need it on her old setup. Furthermore, the tank still needs a screen top and a board to cover the lights. I'll address all of that, introduce Koa for real and potentially fish in a later video. I feel that the guppies from our old tank will take away from the natural look of the new one, so they won't be going in here. I'm unsure if I want to add some other fish or keep it as a turtle only setup, so definitely let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Thanks again to Tanner for helping me out with this video, and if you made it this far, I'm pretty sure you'll also love this video in which I build a Paludarium for my fire-bellied toads. Or if you rather want to learn more about plywood aquariums, you can watch this one next. I'll see ya there.